Okay, and welcome everybody once again to my fifth posted chess game. Today is, first of all, the first game that I'm posting where I played the white pieces, and I'm also playing the first. I'm also posting the first game that I didn't win. This game, well, you'll see what the result was eventually. Well, I might as well tell you right now. I drew the game, I really wanted to post this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a game in which I thought I had a massive attack. I thought I had a really wonderful attack going. I just couldn't close the door because I could not find the best move in the right situation. Also, I compounded a mistake that I made by getting frustrated and make an even bigger mistake that caused me to really have to scramble to salvage a draw near the end of the game. So let's take a look at the game. I played e4, my favorite opening. He plays e5, the king pawn opening. Of course, my second move in this situation is always knight f3. Typical move, he played d6. Very often you'll see knight c6 in this situation. d6 is also fine. In this case, I played a rather conservative move, knight c3. Usually I like to develop my bishop. In this sort of situation, very often I like to just develop the knights and, hold off on determining whether I want to develop my bishop to c4 or to d5. So he develops his bishop to bishop g4, pinning the knight. And again, I'm not particularly worried at this point about it. I can figure maybe I can chase the bishop away. If he moves back to h5, I can move the other pawn up. My king is not castled yet. If my king is castled, then I certainly wouldn't want to move my g pawn. But in the meantime, I'm not particularly worried about that pin at this point. So I bring my bishop out to c4. Developing that. Now he decides to trade it off. Now in this situation, I don't like trading off the bishop for the knight, especially early in the game. At some points in the game, certainly a knight could be worth more than a bishop, but typically at the beginning of the game, I like bishops more than knights. I think they're worth a little bit more. I personally don't like this move from the black standpoint, and I was very happy to see it from my standpoint. I took it back with the queen take f3 in order to avoid wrecking my pawn structure. Also, incidentally, I'm threatening checkmate on f7 over here. Very easy to stop. I mean, this is like the four move checkmate that I used to try on people in second grade, but he stops it relatively easily. He decides, this seems like a pretty aggressive play over here. I guess he figures that if I take the queen, he can retake it with the knight, and development is relatively even. Maybe I'd have a very, very slight edge in development, but without the queens on the board, we're on the fast track toward a close endgame or a draw if I trade off the queens. I didn't want to trade off the queens, so I moved queen g3. I don't want to put it back on its original square. I don't want to clog up the middle by putting it on e2. So I put it on g3, again keeping it in the game a little bit. Now he plays a6, threatening b5 and chasing my bishop out of there. My bishop would either have to go back to here or go back. I'm not particularly worried about now I want to keep my bishop on this diagonal. I want to keep my bishop on the a2 g8 diagonal because I really like the fact that it's aiming at this f7 pawn. That's why I put it on c4 to begin with. I know I hemmed it in a little bit over here. I kind of cut off its escape route, by playing d3, but I want to protect that pawn over here. And of course, I want to be able to develop my dark squared bishop. The most natural square at this point would be develop it to g5 with tempo, if I could do that next turn. He plays b5, threatening my bishop. Nope. So now again, normally I would maybe move back to b3, but I figured I could, push my knight into a very good square over here with tempo. I played knight d5. He's got to move the queen. In fact, there's really only one place for him to move the queen. Well, he can move it to either e7 or d8, because obviously he needs to defend this square. If he moves his queen, let's say, for example, to h6 or something, or even worse, to d5, then I simply take knight takes c7, forking the king and the rook, and maybe even the queen, and obviously that wouldn't be good. That would be really terrible for him. Actually, he can't move. I'm sorry, he can't move to d7 because the knight is defending that square. So he really has to move back to d8, which is what he did. Queen d8, and I figure this way I really take the lead in development a little bit. If you notice, none of his pieces are developed, and I have three solid pieces that are three pieces that are very well developed, and plus my dark squared bishop has a nice open lane over here. So I push my bishop back to b3. That's really the only place for it to go. he plays c6. Now, my knight, rather than going back to the original square, I can tell that I'm going to want to try a kingside attack at some point or another. Because, I have my bishop slicing into this diagonal, I have my queen on this side of the board, this bishop, the dark square bishop can get involved, maybe the rook after I castle with the f-pawn push. So I realize I want a kingside development, so rather than, kingside attack, so rather than moving the knight back to c4, to c3, I play knight e3, allowing the knight, access to this square over here, to f5, maybe even to g4, depending on the situation. He plays a5, threatening to trap the bishop. I obviously am not interested in doing that. On the other hand, I'm not interested in getting my bishop out of that diagonal, so I play a3, something that I very often do. I play a3 because I want to be able to keep my light-squared bishop on this diagonal. It's something that, especially when I play the Italian game, when I play the Guccio Piano, or however you pronounce it, which is basically characterized by e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to c4. Very often has positions like this. He plays a4. Again, I'm not really sure. Obviously, he can't trap the bishop. He's hemming the bishop into one square. The only place I can move is bishop to a2. I'm not really sure why he did that. Normally, very often people, if I put my bishop back here, people will try to cut off this diagonal by getting a secured pawn to c4 or to d5. Over here, he can't really secure a pawn on c4 or d5 because my knight is protecting both of those spots. He can't play d5. He can't really play c5 over here. He'd weaken his pawn structure and create a really nice outpost for my knight over here. So his pawn structure on his queen side, although I really can't expose it very much, isn't really doing a whole lot for him in terms of stopping my attack. Now he plays h5. Again, not really 100% sure what he's doing over there, but maybe looking to harass my queen a little bit. So I played knight f5. This is a really good square for the knight. If this bishop ever moves, then this pawn hangs. It's a very good attacking square. It's a good outpost. It can only be kicked out by a further weakening of his pawn structure, and which is what he did. He played g6. I guess it was just intolerable to him to have my knight at such a threatening outpost. Notice this. Well, this pawn is actually protected by his queen and his bishop, but he's got to develop at some point. He has 0 pieces developed now, and I have 3 solid pieces that are developed, plus that dark squared bishop, which is threatening to come out at some point. So he moves his pawn, again with tempo. I have to move my knight. Rather than moving it back, I decided to do something that's a little counterintuitive. I played knight h4. The reason why it's counterintuitive, as they always say, the knight on the rim is dim. You don't want, usually, to put your knight on the edge of the board, especially because the knight doesn't really have anywhere to go from here. It can't really go back. Obviously, it can't go back to f5. It can go to f3, but then it's really hemming in the queen a little bit and cutting off most of the queen's flight squares. But I wanted to keep it on this side of the board, and there was this idea in the back of my mind that was floating around about maybe sacrificing a piece for blowing open his kingside pawn structure. Again, I don't really think he played the opening very well. I mean, I think later on in the game he did play very well, especially in defense once I did launch my attack. But maybe I was taken in a little bit by his playing possum, by the fact that I really didn't think he did a very good job developing his pieces and pawn structure early in the game. Then he plays knight f6, again a natural developing move on the queen side. He opens up his, he can develop his bishop. He can fianchetto it on g7. He can play it to d7. He can kingside castle might not be the smartest idea over here anyway. This pawn would be, he can't kingside castle. I mean, for example, just to give you an idea, if this bishop would move to d7 and then he'd castle, that would be a disaster for him, because I just play queen take g6, and this pawn would be pinned against his king. But still, developing the knight is certainly not a bad idea at this point. I don't really see what else he's going to do over there. Okay. Whoops! I'm sorry. I gave away my next move, which was, I think, the big move of the early part of the game. So now I really was thinking very much of a piece sacrifice over here. I knew I had my dark squared bishop that I wanted to get into the game. I could play it here immediately. I could play it to b5, but then he could just play the bishop to d7, and then the knight to alleviate the pin on the knight. And I don't really know exactly what I've accomplished. The materials even. In order for me to take advantage of the fact that my pieces are developed and his pawn structure is a little weak, I figured I'd want wanted to sacrifice a piece. Now, there are really two ways to sacrifice a piece. There's knight take g5. Knight take g6. And then if f take g6, then queen take g6 check, and he's going to move his king here.